Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror thriller film named Death Whisperer. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The story begins in a remote village in 1972 as dusk falls. A couple working in the fields discuss their daughter, Nat, who has fallen mysteriously ill. She can no longer walk properly and spends most of her time lying in bed. They decide to save up money to take her to a doctor. Suddenly, they hear Nat screaming from their house. Rushing back in panic, they find her crawling on the ground, crying out in pain. Before their eyes, her stomach swells like a balloon. She vomits blood, and soon after, she begins bleeding profusely from below. Within moments, Nat dies in agony. The scene then shifts to another family in the village. A mother reminds her 3 daughters to come home early after school, as their father plans to take them to the annual temple fair. From their conversation, we learn they have an older brother, Yak, who is in the army and expected to return in a day or two. On the way to school, the eldest sister, Yen, makes a deal with the youngest. If she can run to the school bus first, she'll get a cotton candy treat. The little girl excitedly dashes ahead, but when she reaches an old tree, she suddenly stops. The tree looks eerie and ominous. Yen asks if she saw something, but the youngest shakes her head and runs off without a word. That day, Yen is assigned to clean the classroom. As she sweeps, she notices a girl sitting at a desk. It's Nat's old seat. Shocked, she stares for a moment before realizing it's just her younger sister, Yard, who has found a stack of eerie drawings in Nat's desk. On the back of each paper is Nat's signature. By now, the whole village has heard of Nat's bizarre death, but no one knows what truly caused it. On their way home, the 3 sisters pass by the same old tree. This time, they all see a ghostly figure standing beneath it, a pale, female specter. They exchange uneasy glances but say nothing, choosing instead to briskly walk away. Suddenly, their older brother jumps out at them as a prank, scaring them half to death. Furious, Yen scolds him for nearly scaring them to death. That evening, the brother, who is home from university for the summer, helps the family harvest onions. By the time they return home, it is already dark. Their strict father, holding a cane, demands to know why they are so late. Yen quickly explains that she had cleaning duties at school and missed the earlier bus. Seeing his anger, the second brother suggests punishing them by making them water the fields, an excuse to let them go to the temple fair sooner. For the adults, the fair is a place to pray for safety and good fortune. For the children, it's all about fun and food. Yen buys cotton candy for the youngest, but suddenly Yard starts coughing. When Yen touches her forehead, she realizes she's burning with fever. She wants to tell their mother, but Yard stops her, insisting that if Mom finds out, she won't let her go. Yen sighs. She can't say no to her own sister. However, during the Ferris wheel ride, the youngest notices a deranged woman below, staring directly at them with an unsettling grin. Yard sees it too, and already feeling unwell, she grows even more uncomfortable. Unable to continue, they cut their night short and head home early. The next day, the second brother takes the feverish Yard to the clinic, but the doctor finds nothing wrong with her, prescribing only some supplements. As they prepare to leave, their eldest brother, Yak, suddenly squeezes into the bus. Overjoyed to see him back early, Yard smiles for the first time in days. That evening, the reunited family enjoys dinner together, but before they can finish, Yard complains of a headache and heads to bed. In the middle of the night, the window in her room swings open. Thinking it was just the wind, she gets up to close it, but as soon as she lies back down, the window opens again, by itself. Thinking it was a prank by her brothers, she pulls the curtain aside, but outside there's nothing, no one at all. Except there is something she cannot see. The next thing they know, Yard, who should have been fast asleep, silently opens her bedroom door and walks out. Yen, hearing movement, follows her to the kitchen, asking what she was doing up so late. But Yard doesn't answer. Instead, she continues to chew, her mouth moving unnaturally fast. Yen steps closer, peering into her hands. Yard is devouring something raw, something horrifying. Just as Yen turned off the radio, she glanced back and saw Yard already sitting up in bed saying she was hungry. Then, without another word, she lay back down and went to sleep. Yen found this strange and asked what she had just eaten. Why hadn't she heated it up first? But Yard didn't respond. Whether she was asleep or not was unclear, but she remained silent. Then, something even stranger happened. A bizarre sound echoed through the room, and Yen suddenly blacked out. When she opened her eyes again, the sun was already up. Outside, their father was arguing with the field supervisor. Seeing this, Yak pulled the supervisor aside. The supervisor insisted that once today's work was done, he had to leave. Yak pressed him for a reason, but the supervisor hesitated, reluctant to say more. He simply stated that he refused to stay. With that, he walked off, and the other workers followed. Luckily, with the three brothers at home, they quickly finished the remaining farm work. Since falling ill, Yard's personality had changed drastically. She seemed like a completely different person. Yen suggested she go outside and get some sun, as the weather was nice. But instead of agreeing, Yard snapped at the youngest, demanding a back massage. Seeing her attitude, Yen grew frustrated and the two argued. Their mother overheard the commotion and came to check, but before Yen could say anything, Yard spoke first, playing the victim. She tearfully insisted that her older sister was forcing her outside when she was sick and not feeling well. She even muttered that she should sneak out before her dad comes home. Yard had always been obedient, and now that she was sick, their mother believed her without question. Yen, unable to explain herself, had no choice but to take the youngest and leave the house. While they were talking, the youngest confided in Yen, saying that last night Yard hadn't slept at all. She had been staring at her the entire time, her face looking terrifying, almost like she was possessed. Remembering the unsettling events in the kitchen the night before, Yen decided to tell their mother everything. But their mother dismissed it, reasoning that Yard's illness could explain her strange behavior. That day, their parents had to go into town and wouldn't be back until the next day. Before leaving, they instructed Yen to take good care of her siblings. In truth, the three brothers had also noticed that Yard was acting increasingly unusual. Her condition fluctuated between good and bad, but even the doctors couldn't diagnose her with anything specific. Yak asked if they had encountered anything strange recently. Yen recalled hearing a woman's eerie voice in the middle of the night a few days ago, but she couldn't understand what it was saying. That night, Yard once again left her room. Yen was about to follow her, but the strange voice returned, sending chills down her spine to her smelly butt. She bit the inside of her hand, forcing herself to stay awake. This time, instead of chasing after her directly, she decided to wake her brothers for help. But when she entered their room, she found their beds empty. Suddenly, a sharp scream pierced the air. It was the youngest sister. Yen had no choice but to rush back. She found the youngest trembling in fear, refusing to let go of her. At that moment, Yak's voice called out from outside. Yen wanted to go to him, but the youngest wouldn't let her leave. In the end, she convinced her to hide inside the dark closet. When she reached the door, she saw her three brothers already outside. It turned out that they had sensed something was wrong and had gone looking for Yard earlier. The third brother told her to stay inside, insisting they would handle the situation. As they argued, Yen suddenly noticed a figure standing in the field. She pointed it out, and when the third brother followed her gaze, he was instantly terrified. A ghostly woman was staring at them, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Yak, unshaken, immediately pulled out a gun and fired. The woman vanished without traces of her smell. Meanwhile, the second brother had found Yard and rushed her inside. She woke up complaining of stomach pain but had no memory of what had just happened. Not wanting to scare her, no one said a word. The question remained, how had the three brothers realized Yard was missing? Earlier that evening, with their parents away, the brothers had decided to stay up drinking. The two younger ones quickly got drunk, leaving Yen awake and bored. That was when strange things began happening. The lights flickered, the radio crackled with distorted voices, and an eerie energy seemed to disrupt the air around him. As these supernatural disturbances intensified, Yard walked out of the house. At first, Yak thought to call out to her, but suddenly his legs went weak and his vision blurred. At the same time, he heard the mysterious woman's voice that Yen had described. Thinking quickly, he grabbed a kerosene lamp and burned his own hand. The sharp pain jolted him back to full consciousness. Wasting no time, he woke his two brothers, and they armed themselves before heading out to find her. They found Yard crouched in the field, clutching her stomach in pain, and that was when they saw the ghost. Yak didn't hesitate. He fired a shot, but it had no effect. The ghost simply disappeared with her bulletproof muscles. By now, even Yen knew what had happened. She asked the brothers if the ghost they saw had long hair, dressed in black as if attending a funeral. The answer was yes. Yen had seen the same ghost at their uncle's house. Putting together all the strange occurrences, they came to a chilling conclusion. Yard was now being haunted by the ghost. The next day, Yak decided to drive into town to find a spiritual priest. Before leaving, he suddenly brought up the case of Nat, the girl who had died mysteriously. He couldn't shake the feeling that what was happening to Yard was eerily similar to what had happened to Nat. As for the hauntings in their home, Yak instructed everyone to keep it a secret from their parents. He knew they wouldn't believe them anyway. It turned out that Yak had learned about Nat's death from a letter their mother had sent him. Something about the way she died had felt off, and it had left him uneasy. That was why he had taken leave from work to come back home. Yak gave Yen some pocket money to buy snacks for their younger sisters. She wanted to get some palm fruit for Yard, but Yard suggested they go out together for some fresh air. Just as Yen was asking their mother for permission, a woman climbed in through the window. It wasn't just any woman, it was the mad woman from the temple fair. Yard was terrified, but before she could scream in a chicken voice, the mad woman covered her chicken mouth with a fist. Yard was no match for her and was completely overpowered. The mad woman then pulled out one of Yard's teeth and swallowed it. Only then did Yard manage to let out a wail of pain. Hearing the scream, Yen and their mother rushed over immediately. Their mother recognized the mad woman, who was from the village. Seeing her daughter being attacked, their mother didn't hold back, giving the mad woman a fierce beating before throwing her out of the house. Not long after, Yak returned with a Taoist priest. By then, Yard was acting strangely again. When the priest asked what was wrong, she spat in his face and glared at him with wide eyes, warning him to stay away and mind his own business, or else she would tear his smelly part apart. The priest initially suspected that the mad woman's spirit had possessed Yard, but she denied it, saying that the mad woman wasn't capable of something this powerful. The mad woman practiced dark magic, but her misdeeds had eventually backfired on her, driving her insane. There were rumors that the mad woman herself had been possessed by an evil spirit. Out of fear of being cursed, the villagers had always kept their distance from her. Whenever something strange happened, she was the first person they suspected. The priest now believed that the evil spirit that had once possessed the mad woman was trying to transfer to Yard, though it hadn't fully succeeded yet. Up in the mountains, the mad woman was preparing a sinister ritual using Yard's tooth. A jar filled with foul-smelling flesh and blood sat before her, mixed with her own urine. Just as she was about to drop the tooth into the jar, Yak and the Taoist priest arrived. Without hesitation, Yak kicked over the jar, interrupting the ritual. The woman was too deranged to give them any clear answers, but what happened next was shocking. Right before their eyes, the mad woman slammed her mad head against a wooden post, ending her mad life instantly. The priest explained that the evil spirit had forced the mad woman to take her own life because it had found a better host, who is Yard. The priest warned them that the spirit would roam freely at night, but would return to its host by daylight. If it wanted to possess a new body, Yard's tooth was the key. Unfortunately, the priest admitted they were too late to stop the process completely. He instructed Yak to take good care of Yard and left to find another solution. That night, Yen and the youngest sister slept in Yak's room, while the three brothers took turns guarding Yard. Around midnight, eerie noises echoed through the house. This time, everyone heard them. Yak ordered his younger brothers to burn their hands with fire to stay awake, but they were a little too late. Both fell unconscious. Yak barely managed to stay alert, while Yen remained awake by biting into her own hand. Then Yard stepped out of her room, mumbling under her breath as she snuffed out the oil lamp. With a double attack from the spirit, Yak finally collapsed. Only Yen remained conscious. Seeing that none of her brothers could be woken up, she had no choice but to slap Yak awake. Once he came to, they managed to revive the other two as well. The brothers instructed Yen to stay in the house while they grabbed their weapons and went outside to search for Yard. Their parents, hearing the commotion, also rushed over. When their father learned that Yard had been possessed and had run off, he refused to believe their smelly bullshit. Just then, a chilling laugh echoed through the air. Enraged, Yak taunted the spirit, daring it to show itself. Their mother pleaded with Yak to stay calm and not provoke the entity, but their father remained skeptical, insisting that ghosts didn't exist and accusing his son of making things up. He even tried to take away Yak's gun. Furious, Yak argued back, which earned him a harsh slap from their father. Then, suddenly, stones began raining down from the rooftop. It was only then that their father's disbelief was shattered. Under Yak's command, the three brothers split up to search for Yard. Yak was searching the cornfield when he heard someone calling his name. The voice kept shifting positions, making it impossible to pinpoint. Even with a gun in his hand, he couldn't get a clear aim. After a moment of silence, he suddenly spotted a figure and instinctively pulled the trigger. But to his horror, he realized he had shot their mother instead. Devastated, he cried out that he had told her to stay at home. However, instead of responding normally, their mother let out an eerie laugh. Then, she slowly stood up, using her hands to realign her head, which had been knocked askew by the bullet. It was then that Yak realized the woman before him wasn't their mother at all. He turned and ran, with the headless ghost chasing close behind. The horrifying sight of the spirit pursuing him without a head was something he would never forget. As Yak ran out of the cornfield, he heard his mother's voice behind him again. Without hesitation, he fired his gun. Fortunately, the third brother arrived just in time, knocking the barrel off course. This time, it really was their mother. Meanwhile, a knock came from the back door of the house. It was Yard's voice begging Yen to let her in. The youngest sister, half asleep, reached out to open the door, but Yen quickly stopped her, telling her that's not her sister out there. The entity outside lost patience. A bloodied hand reached through the door crack and unlatched the bolt. Yen and the youngest huddled together in terror, too afraid to lift their heads. Minute by minute, time crawled by, but the expected danger never came. Then, urgent knocking rang out at the front door. When they opened it, it was truly their mother this time. The next day, the Taoist priest returned with an exorcist for reinforcement. Before entering the house, the priest walked around the property, observing the lush bamboo grove and the vegetable garden. Impatient to save his sister, Yak urged him to hurry inside. The priest, unbothered, told him not to be so anxious. He needed to learn patience, and brute force alone won't solve this. Before stepping into Yard's room, the priest drew a talisman on the door. Only the parents and Yak were allowed inside. Everyone else had to wait outside. The priest spoke gently, persuading the spirit to leave on its own. But words alone wouldn't work. Using Yard's body, the entity pitifully pleaded with their mother, begging her to come closer. The mother's heart ached for her child, and despite the warnings, she hesitated. Yak quickly stopped her and took control of Yard himself. The priest placed his hand on Yard's forehead. Instantly, her eyes turned bloodshot, and her body convulsed violently. The priest worked fast. The entity, knowing it couldn't win, tried its old trick, playing the victim to earn the mother's sympathy. It worked. Despite everyone's protests, the mother rushed forward, cradling her daughter protectively, and even demanding the priest leave. Now, under her mother's shelter, the entity smirked in triumph. The father, furious, stormed outside and returned with a willow branch ready to strike. But the entity wasn't afraid. When the father scolded Yard, she snapped back at him, fueling his rage. Losing control, he pushed his wife aside, grabbed his daughter and yanked her from the bed, only to slip and fall hard on the floor. During this exchange, the priest noticed something crucial. The entity was weaker in daylight. Although the exorcism hadn't fully succeeded, pressing on its forehead earlier had weakened it temporarily. To sever its connection completely, they needed to destroy its anchor. The priest turned to Yak, telling him to go to the backyard and chop down the bamboo. As long as it's here, the exorcism will be difficult. The father, who treasured the bamboo, would be furious, but Yak didn't hesitate. His sister's life came first. He began cutting, but sure enough, the father arrived, enraged. Before he could stop them, the priest asked him if he noticed a change in himself and his wife. This spirit thrived on manipulating emotions. Those who were unstable became easy prey. The father had always been strict, but under the spirit's influence, he had grown violent, even lashing out at his own family. The mother, normally kind, had become blindly protective, to the point of sabotaging the exorcism. The priest urged him to reflect. After a moment's thought, the father's anger faded. He gave his silent approval, and Yak and his two younger brothers resumed chopping. Suddenly, a foul stench filled the air. As expected, something was buried among the bamboo. The priest explained that this pile of rotting flesh is the entity's tool. It uses these organs to bind itself to its host. The bamboo masked the smell, which is why no one noticed anything was wrong. Burning the flesh should have been enough to end it. But the third brother, ever curious, decided to poke at it with a bamboo stick. The entity snapped. Possessing Yard, it charged at them, eyes burning with fury and warning to kill them all if they didn't stop. But it was too weak now. The brothers worked together to restrain Yard, pinning her down. Yak lit a fire and burned the decayed flesh. The priest pulled a hidden dagger from his cane and drove it into the ground. With that, the bond between the entity and its host was severed. The father and second brother stayed behind to look after the youngest sister, while the others took Yard to the hospital. On the way, Yak turned to the priest, asking why the entity chose Yard and if it was because she was weak. The priest said, "It's the opposite. Normally, spirits prefer weak bodies, but this one was cunning. It chose a strong, healthy host, someone exceptional. When Yard was just a few months old, she had nearly died of malaria. After recovering, she never got sick or injured again. The priest explained that hosts like her were rare, so when the entity found her, it abandoned the madwoman and latched onto her instead. It's worth noting that the entity hadn't truly left. As night fell, its power grew stronger. Just as everyone feared it might try to stop them from reaching the hospital, something strange happened. Everyone in the car, except for Yak, who was driving, suddenly vanished. Of course, this was just an illusion. In reality, they were still in the car, but they too were experiencing hallucinations. They saw the ghost of the deceased Nat standing in the middle of the road, and then, in the blink of an eye, she jumped onto the car. The priest quickly instructed Yen and her brother to shut their eyes. If they couldn't see the ghost couldn't see them. Meanwhile, Yak saw a group of ghostly women blocking the road. Without hesitation, he floored the gas pedal and sped straight through them. But then, he saw his entire family standing in the middle of the road ahead. Realizing it was another illusion, he didn't hesitate. He pulled out his gun and fired. The car barreled through the trees, and in an instant, everything returned to normal. However, a chilling, familiar noise echoed through the car. The pressure weighed heavily on Yak, but he managed to stay conscious. The priest attempted to make a move, but the ghost viciously bit off his finger. One by one, the passengers slipped into unconsciousness, leaving Yak alone to battle the entity. The struggle sent the car veering out of control until it crashed into a tree. The priest died on the spot. When Yak finally crawled out of the wreckage, he saw his unconscious family and even the priest being dragged outside by the ghost. His gun was gone too, now in the ghost's hands. Grinning menacingly, the ghost sneered, saying that at first it only wanted Yard's body, but their whole family just had to interfere. Now, it would have to kill them all. Just as it was about to attack, the priest suddenly regained consciousness, but before he could utter a single last word, a gunshot rang out. He was dead like a piece of shit. The ghost, now wielding the gun, was deciding who to kill next with only 3 bullets left. Yak panicked, urging the ghost to kill him and let his siblings go. At that moment, Yen woke up. As Yak rushed toward Yard, she tossed the priest's cane to him. Without missing a beat, he drew a knife and stabbed Yard's arm, not wanting to give the ghost an uninjured body. Surprisingly, the plan worked. Yard coughed up a mouthful of black blood, and the ghost was forcibly expelled from her body. Wasting no time, Yak took aim and fired, blasting the ghost's head apart. By dawn, Yard had regained consciousness in her hospital bed. She had no memory of the past few days. Thinking it was all over, Yen smiled and said from now on, he would take care of all the chores for her. But mid-sentence, Yard's expression suddenly changed. She reached into her mouth and pulled out a bloody tooth. Her body convulsed violently and then her stomach started to swell, just like when Nat had died. By the time the family rushed into the room, Yard was already vomiting blood uncontrollably. It wasn't long before she was gone. In the final scene, the grief-stricken family watched as Yard's body was cremated. After returning home, Yak grabbed an axe and went straight to the eerie old tree in the yard. Beneath it stood a wooden shrine used for offerings. Without hesitation, he hacked it to pieces, then set it ablaze. Death Whisperer, Part 2. Previously in Part 1, the sister Yard becomes possessed by a black-clad female ghost. After Yak and others battle wits and strength to save her, she still succumbs to death. Her passing leaves everyone feeling heavy-hearted. Even though 3 years have passed, they still haven't moved past the grief of losing her. In order to avenge her, Yak embarks on a new path as a professional ghost hunter. One day, Yak and the priest receive a request to exorcise a ghost. This priest is the same one who got shot in the head previously, but he seems to have survived the attack. The client tells them that her husband has been possessed by an evil spirit, and he spends all his time hiding in the house, cutting his own arms with a knife. He seems incredibly violent. Yak and the priest bring guns loaded with enchanted bullets. When they arrive, they find it's just a small ghost. Tricking the untrained is easy, but it almost fooled them too. In fact, word of Yak's quest for revenge has spread through the ghost community. The small ghost thought he could provoke Yak and maybe take him down before he even gets his revenge. Yak just laughed, saying they don't need to use a sledgehammer to kill a fly. He handed the gun to the priest and began wrapping his hands with boxing bandages, pouring holy water onto them to enchant it. To prevent the ghost from escaping, the priest, along with others, reoriented the outside staircase. Inside, the small ghost was pummeled by Yak's fists, crying out in pain. It tried to escape up the stairs, but found no exit outside, its brain short-circuiting. It had no choice but to return and bargain with Yak. The small ghost claims to know the whereabouts of the black-clad female ghost. It was raised by a corpse-eating ghoul, and the ghoul's lair is located in Donkomo. The ghost intended to use this information to bargain for its release, but it hadn't considered that Yak, who hates evil spirits, would never send it to the afterlife. Yak pretended to agree, and once the ghost transferred from the husband to a catfish, he threw the catfish into the fire, burning the ghost to ashes. However, the information it provided was still of interest to Yak. With the priest's help, he learned that the first recorded corpse-eating ghoul was called King Ghoul. King Ghoul built a wooden house in a temple and controlled other ghouls to devour 3 villagers. The villagers then hired a monk to exorcise it, but the monk was ineffective, and King Ghoul easily escaped, vanishing in a place called Donkamo. After that, no one ever heard of King Ghoul again. Yak plans to go to Donkamo to track down the black-clad ghost. The bad news is that Donkamo lies within a perilous, primeval forest filled with supernatural creatures. The priest once patrolled nearby while serving in the military and nearly lost his life. The good news is that King Ghoul's power should be much weaker now. In the 3 years since the black-clad ghost disappeared, there have been several cases of babies being killed and their organs vanishing. Yak suspects that King Ghoul, unable to hunt adults, has resorted to targeting infants. This makes it the perfect time to deal with him. If the black-clad ghost revives and joins him in hunting, King Ghoul's strength will surge, and they may no longer be able to defeat him. Determined to avenge his sister, Yak is resolute in his decision to head to Donkamo. The priest insists on joining him as well, pointing out that it would be too dangerous to venture into the forest alone. The priest also has a personal vendetta against the black-clad ghost. During the rescue of Yard, the priest was shot in the head by the ghost. Had the ghost been a better shot, the priest would have already gone to the afterlife. After walking so close to death, the priest has a deep grudge against the black-clad ghost. Meanwhile, the other members of Yak's family are just trying to live peacefully. The eldest sister, Yen, even found someone to marry. Today is the day she and her fiancé are getting engaged. Both families meet to exchange blessings, and Yak naturally can't be absent. He warns the fiancé to treat his sister well, or he'll send him straight to the ICU. Although Yak's tough words were meant for the sake of his older sister, and although the fiancé got along well with him when the family sat down for dinner together in the evening, the father thought Yak had gone a bit too far. He'd been out hunting ghosts for so many days, and now, after returning, he was causing trouble at home. The mother also urged Yak to come home to stay, reminding him that it had been 3 years since the black-clad ghost incident. She might not return, but Yak knew that it was just a form of psychological comfort for the family. With the black-clad ghost's strong, vengeful nature, she would undoubtedly come after them again. Furthermore, the family wasn't as calm as they appeared. Every night, they took turns standing guard with guns, lighting an oil lamp, and drinking a bottle of liquor to get through the night. Despite this, they still seemed to have an anxiety response. Whenever night fell, they felt as if something was lurking outside the house. Thus, even though the other 2 brothers didn't have the same boldness as Yak, they privately supported his quest for revenge. Even Yen and the youngest sister chose to believe in him. So, with the hopes of his whole family resting on him, Yak set off on his journey with the priest. The 2 arrived safely in the place where the temple is located. However, their car broke down in the middle of the road. At that moment, a local landlord approached them, claiming to run a logging camp and offering to help them, but on the condition that Yak and the priest take him along. The landlord revealed that his ancestors were among the 3 villagers eaten by King Ghoul 100 years ago. Therefore, he had a deep-seated grudge against King Ghoul. The landlord not only provided transportation, but also brought along 4 helpers, a shaman hunter, his 2 nephews, and a porter. Soon after, they reached the primeval forest. The shaman, hired by the landlord to guide them, explained that in such a vast natural forest, guardian spirits existed, and everything they did required the spirit's approval. The big nephew, however, didn't believe in such superstitions, and as soon as they arrived, began urinating by an ancient tree. Sure enough, the priest's ritual was met with resistance. The knife he plunged into the ground could not be pulled out, meaning the guardian spirit disapproved of their entry. Seeing this, Yak thought the priest was too weak, so he took the priest's tool, inserted it into the ground, and with a powerful pull, loosened the packed earth, creating a small hole. This indicated that the guardian spirit had granted approval. However, as the group proceeded into the forest, the hole behind them sealed itself, showing that the guardian spirit had merely given a false impression of approval. The forest was dangerous, filled not only with wild animals, but also wandering ghosts. After walking for a while, they encountered a warning call from a wild animal, a sign of intruders in its territory. The little nephew, who had studied abroad, suddenly remembered a ghost story the priest had shared about tigers being possessed by spirits and transforming into humans to harm people. He jokingly asked the priest whether that story was true, showing no respect for the forest or its dangers. The priest advised him to be cautious with his life, warning that if he saw or heard anything strange, he should stay silent. Yak felt that these two annoying nephews were useless distractions. He didn't understand why the landlord had brought these burdens along, to which the landlord explained that he had no choice. When these nephews were infants, their mother had been killed by a ghoul, and the landlord had taken on the responsibility of raising them. Yak then asked what deep enmity his family had with King Ghoul, and since when King Ghoul had been hunting his family. The landlord explained that his family had hired monks to exorcise King Ghoul, but the plan backfired. After escaping death, King Ghoul manipulated other ghouls to prolong his life, then sent ghosts to hunt down the landlord's great-grandfather and all his descendants. The landlord's parents were also killed. If it weren't for the protective talisman on him, he would have long since passed away. Of course, the talisman couldn't kill King Ghoul, so he also carried a powerful knife, which he believed could finally put an end to King Ghoul's terror. However, despite walking for so long, they had yet to find King Ghoul's lair. The big nephew couldn't stand the exhaustion and asked the shaman to chant a summoning spell. The shaman could only think he was too crazy, because the moment the spell was cast, not only did King Ghoul arrive, but all the evil spirits hiding in the forest also appeared, as if they were rushing to receive an offering. Suddenly, an unexpected turn of events occurred. A cobra slithered in front of them, blocking their path. At first, they thought it was just passing through, but to their surprise, it circled around them and stubbornly refused to leave. The priest soon realized that the cobra was a warning from the guardian spirit. The shaman hadn't expected a mere snake to block their way. Determined, the shaman tried to use his skills to drive the cobra away, but before he could complete his spell, the cobra bit his face off, killing him instantly. Startled, the big nephew quickly raised his gun and shot the cobra in the head. His actions were so sudden that the others couldn't react in time, and this angered the guardian spirit. With the situation escalating, the group could only prepare the shaman's body for burial on the spot. Yak suggested they split up, as dealing with these useless companions was infuriating. However, the landlord disagreed. Without the shaman as their guide, he and his two nephews would be blind in the forest, so he assured Yak they wouldn't cause any more trouble. The big nephew, however, failed to understand his uncle's good intentions, and provocatively mentioned the death of Yard. In this open space, with no need for caution, Yak gave him a good beating. However, he remained rational. No matter how much internal strife there was, finding the ghost remained the priority. The restless souls and wandering ghosts had already set their sights on them. The eerie sounds surrounding them were made by these spirits. The priest suggested they set up camp, but warned them not to make themselves targets by staying on the ground. So before nightfall, they quickly built a platform in the trees to rest on. Meanwhile, back home, the father had begun another night of guard duty. This night, however, was different. The wind outside howled, and the oil lamp almost went out. Inside, Yen and the youngest sister were chatting, when suddenly, the youngest fell silent. Yen wiped her head with a towel, only to find a tuft of hair on it. She thought if this hair loss was from using the wrong shampoo. Then she heard the whisper of the black-clad ghost. The youngest slowly turned her head toward Yen. Her mouth moved, but the voice that came out was that of the female ghost. Yen was terrified, but even more so when the youngest pulled out her own tooth and, in the voice of the ghost, said she was right here. Yen screamed in fear and tried to run like a panicked chicken, but the door suddenly slammed shut in front of her. The black-clad ghost then rushed toward her and grabbed her by the chick neck. However, from the little girl's perspective, there was no ghost in the room. She saw her own hand around her sister's neck. The family rushed to the scene, and after some chaotic yet coordinated actions, Yen was saved. It turned out that since Yard's death, Yen had developed a form of hysteria and could only snap out of her imagined hallucinations through extreme pain. Yak was still unaware of his sister's condition. Meanwhile, in the forest, night had fallen. The group rested on the tree platform, but no one dared to sleep. The landlord reminded them that unless absolutely necessary, they should not go down from the platform. If they saw or heard anything, they should not act hastily. But just as he finished speaking, a cry for help from the shaman echoed from below. The shaman had been killed right in front of them by the cobra, so this voice was undoubtedly a malevolent ghost in disguise. They remained still and kept their wits about them, but the ghost seemed to be able to teleport. In an instant, it appeared on top of the platform like a monkey climbing toward them. The big nephew, hearing the priest shout for them to climb down, immediately dropped down from the platform, leaving the others stunned. The priest was also startled, asking who told him to jump down. Now they thought everything they'd experienced until then must have been an illusion. The big nephew, realizing his mistake, tried to climb back up, but to his horror, the ghost was perched on the platform. Fortunately, he still had his gun and began firing wildly. The bullets rained down on his teammates, and the porter was the first to be shot through the abdomen and fell off the platform. The others scrambled to climb down and hide behind trees, but the big nephew's madness didn't stop. He saw the ghost crouching on his shoulder, and when he aimed his gun at it, the barrel was controlled by the ghost and pushed to his chin. Before he could react, the bullet exploded through his head, killing him instantly in a manner similar to the cobra's fate. His body then slithered away into the grass like a snake. At this point, the porter suddenly said that they should hurry and climb the tree. The priest, however, felt that the trees were no longer safe. He had once encountered a ghost that could drive a car, so it wasn't too surprising to think there could be one that could climb trees. To get through the night safely, they would need to find a salt flat. Salt flats are typically found in flat, open areas and are considered holy ground that can protect them from evil spirits and curses. As long as they reach the salt flat, they would be safe for a while. Otherwise, they would all die tonight. Hearing this, the porter grew anxious. Salt flats were hard to find, and there were spirits everywhere. It would be difficult to leave. Yak then asked the priest to teach everyone an exorcism chant, but unfortunately, the priest's chant was so long that no one could memorize it. They stumbled over the words, and Yak asked the priest if there was a shorter version. The priest was frustrated. He hadn't learned any short chants. It was then that the porter suddenly started mumbling a chant they couldn't understand. Everyone froze in shock. This guy had turned into a ghost and was now rambling on. Yak punched him, complaining that this ghost was talking too much. But before they could relax, the body of the big nephew, still holding a gun, came back around. Yak had no choice but to shoot the body with an enchanted bullet, bringing it down. Soon after, whispers from all directions filled the forest, and the remaining 4 were all targeted. The priest quickly suggested they run, with Yak leading the way, gun in hand, and the others following behind. Even with this strategy, the little nephew got separated from the group. He could hear the calls of his uncles coming from all directions, but when he ran toward the voices, no one was there. During the frantic escape, the little nephew suddenly realized he had ended up back where he started. In his confusion, he was tripped by a ghostly hand and tumbled down a slope. Meanwhile, the little nephew who had been following closely behind was actually a ghost impersonating the shaman. The shaman ghost attempted to ambush Yak, but with his peak combat skills, Yak shot the ghost with an enchanted bullet, disintegrating it. The little nephew who had fallen woke up from his daze, only to find his back stabbed and diabetic blood pouring from the wound. The nearby spirits, drawn by the scent of blood with sugar flavor, began to salivate. In a panic, the little nephew babbled on, claiming he would become a monk when they returned and pray for the ghosts. His rambling words seemed to calm the spirits around him, but it wasn't because they believed him. A greater threat was approaching, and just as the little nephew spoke, a tiger's roar echoed, and before he knew it, his body was torn in two. Meanwhile, Yak, the priest, and the landlord had found the salt flat. The priest began casting a protective spell in the salt flat, assuring everyone that as long as they stayed there, no ghosts could enter. But just as the priest finished his spell, the little nephew appeared at the edge of the salt flat, calling out to his uncle, asking to be let in. Seeing his pathetic state, the landlord felt sorry for him, and the priest suggested that if the little nephew could recite the exorcism chant, they could let him in. The little nephew hesitated, and the landlord also paused. Yak steadied his gun. At this point, the little nephew had already become the pawn ghost of a tiger, assisting the tiger in its hunting and training. But with enchanted bullets and the approaching dawn, the tiger was forced to retreat, leaving the remaining 3 to stay safely in the salt flat until morning. As daylight broke, the group found a path leading out of the forest. At the end of the path, they discovered a tree hollow made of woven branches. Inside was the hiding place of King Ghoul in Donkamo. The entrance was soaked in fresh blood, and around it were voodoo dolls, each sealed with a charm. These were likely the spirits controlling the ghosts attacking them. Yak recognized one of the dolls. It resembled the black-clad ghost. In a fit of anger, he threw the doll into the ground and stomped on it. In contrast to Yak's sudden outburst, the priest remained calm. Not seeing King Ghoul anywhere, he decided to search nearby. However, King Ghoul wasn't as weak as he had imagined. Hiding in the mud, he was able to overpower the lone priest with ease. Using a voodoo doll, King Ghoul choked the priest by the throat. When Yak and the landlord arrived after hearing the gunshot, they found the priest on the ground, already dead. King Ghoul hadn't attacked Yak or the landlord. When Yak demanded to know the whereabouts of the black-clad ghost, King Ghoul responded that he didn't know, as he wasn't her master. In fact, it was the ghost who had imprisoned and controlled him, acting as the true mastermind. It's revealed that 100 years ago, King Ghoul was just a soldier on the battlefield. His army was constantly defeated by the enemy, and one by one, his comrades were killed. When he was cornered, he suddenly saw a black-clad ghost. The ghost told him if he didn't want to die, he must accept her. She then shoved her juicy tongue all the way into his stomach, but not to his smelly butt. The next second, the enemies on the battlefield began to kill each other in a bizarre, absurd massacre. He became the only survivor, and from that moment on, he became the corpse-eating ghoul of the black-clad ghost. Under her command, he was forced to hunt and kill humans to feed her, his own children included, who became her meals. Although King Ghoul gained immortality, the guilt in his heart grew day by day. In fact, he longed to kill the black-clad ghost more than anyone else. 100 years ago, he had planned to hunt ghosts and almost succeeded. If it weren't for the landlord's great-grandfather disrupting his ritual by sending monks to interfere, the black-clad ghost would have died in the temple's cabin. After that failure, and because King Ghoul refused to kill for the ghost any longer, he fled and hid in the primitive forest of Donkamo. If the black-clad ghost found him and reclaimed the juicy tongue she had shoved into his stomach, her power would become invincible. At this point, Yak asked, if the ghost is so powerful, why can't she find him? This was thanks to the bracelet on King Ghoul's wrist, known as the Talisman, which allowed him to evade the ghost's notice. However, just then, the landlord swung his magic knife and severed King Ghoul's wrist, taking the talisman with it. It turned out this was a deal between the landlord and the black-clad ghost. In exchange for the landlord's help in retrieving the juicy tongue, the ghost promised not to consume the members of his family and would grant him freedom. Yak was stunned but didn't show much surprise. King Ghoul seemed to have known this was coming. He had lived long enough and felt it was time for his life to end. He handed over the responsibility of dealing with the ghost to Yak, believing he was trustworthy. Yak was taken aback by King Ghoul's dying words, but before he could ask more questions, the black-clad ghost suddenly appeared. With a series of seductive whispers, she extracted her juicy tongue from King Ghoul's body, causing him to die instantly. The ghost then fully manifested as her complete form. The landlord, who thought he had completed his task and would now be safe, was shocked when she turned her attention to him. So never make deals with ghosts. Humans speak human language, but ghosts speak the language of the dead, and no one can ever trust their words. The black-clad ghost didn't plan on sparing Yak either. At this point, he truly feared for his shitty life. Enchanted bullets were ineffective against her, and even his willpower was weakening under the influence of her whispers. He watched helplessly as his hands turned the gun toward his own stomach and pulled the trigger. Yak is dead. His death, however, didn't satisfy the ghost. She decided to consume his entire family. The next day was Yen's wedding, and the family gathered at the hotel to prepare for the celebration. However, due to a torrential downpour outside, the hotel staff was delayed, leaving only one receptionist to attend to them. Perhaps because it was such a joyful occasion, the family didn't complain, but instead set up the venue themselves. The men worked in the hotel lobby, while the women went to fetch the wedding ribbons. But as the mother, Yen, and the youngest entered the hallway, the entire hotel building suddenly lost power. The lightning and thunder outside made everyone's heart skip a beat. At that moment, the floor of the hallway began to crumble, as if someone had stepped on it. But the only people there were the mother and her two daughters. Yen, in a daze, seemed to see the black-clad ghost, while the men in the lobby sensed something was wrong. The fiancé, rushing to find Yen, was knocked unconscious when the door slammed shut just as he was about to leave. The door then locked completely. Moments later, the lights came back on in the building, and wedding music began playing on the loudspeakers. But they all knew something was terribly wrong. The father's regular handgun couldn't break the lock. Only enchanted bullets could destroy it. But before they could make it out of the lobby, the voice on the loudspeaker transformed into the ghost's whisper. The family lost the ability to move as they succumbed to the whispers, only able to resist with chants and pain to keep from falling asleep. The little girl, being the weakest, was groggy and was led away by her mother. But behind her departure, the mother and Yen were still lying on the ground, struggling in pain. The fiancé had also been controlled by the ghost. He had once given the little girl a doll that she loved very much. Perhaps that doll was the second reason they were so easily controlled. When the fiancé regained consciousness, he transformed from a sweet, harmless man into a raging lunatic, attacking his future father-in-law and two uncles. Fortunately, his fighting skills were pitifully weak, and he was knocked unconscious again in the one-on-three confrontation. Meanwhile, the mother quickly realized her little daughter was missing, and when she followed the sounds to find her, the black-clad ghost was waiting. In an instant, the mother was also under the ghost's control. She grabbed a hammer from the room and started the deadly game between the living and the dead. However, the mother who took the little girl wasn't the ghost herself, but rather a corpse-eating ghoul controlled by the ghost. In the previous movie, the ghoul had helped the ghost possess Yard's body, and now she was after the youngest sister. The little girl, however, was incredibly clever and emotionally stable. Despite trembling in fear from the ghoul's terrifying presence, she used an umbrella to jab into her peeping eye, and while the ghoul was temporarily blinded, she fled in a frenzy. But no matter how fast she ran, a child could never outrun a ghost. In a moment of despair, the girl remembered a conversation with her brother Yak. He had told her that if a ghost appeared, all she needed to do was put a candy in her mouth and everything would be fine. Ghosts liked to scare people, and if you ignored them, they would leave. So, trembling as the ghost drew closer, the girl put a candy in her mouth. At that moment, she saw the emergency exit door open, and standing at the door was her mother. But this mother was terrifying. Controlled by the ghost, she was now intent on sending her daughter to hell to meet Satan. Terrified, the girl fled again like a chicken, only to be chased by Ghoul. The two played a deadly game of hide-and-seek. In a moment of desperation, the girl had an idea. She threw her shoes into the corridor and hid behind a nearby table. When the mother saw the shoes, she moved toward the corridor, but the girl didn't escape. Behind her, crouching in the shadows, was the ghoul. She screamed in fear, and her cry brought her mother rushing to her. Floating in the air, the mother looked at her daughter on the floor and raised the hammer, gently telling her not to be afraid and the pain will pass soon. She then swung the hammer down with all her might. In that split second, the brothers finally arrived. They stopped the mother from hurting the girl, but against the power of the black-clad ghost, they quickly fell into a disadvantage. Just then, salvation arrived. Miraculously, Yak and the priest showed up. Weren't they supposed to be dead? Let's rewind a few hours. At the time, the priest had only been knocked unconscious by King Ghoul. He found Yak and woke him up. He then explained that although Yak's stomach was covered in blood, there were no fatal wounds. Before King Ghoul died, he had written a protective spell on his voodoo doll, which shielded Yak's skin from being pierced by bullets. King Ghoul had helped Yak because of his dying wish. He wanted Yak to rid the world of the black-clad ghost. Now, as Yak watched the crazed mother, he quickly saw through the black-clad ghost's scheme. He and the priest restrained the mother, then pressed King Ghoul's talisman to her forehead. As the mother cried out in pain, the ghost's control over her finally dissipated. But the black-clad ghost wasn't about to give up. Her true target had always been Yen. When the lone Yen was caught by the ghost, she was thrown into a room that suddenly transformed into her bedroom at home, littered with broken glass. The long-dead Yard sat on the bed calling her name. Yard expressed how much she missed her family and how happy she was for Yen's upcoming wedding. But then her tone shifted, accusing Yen of abandoning the family after her marriage and calling it an act of ingratitude. Yen quickly tried to explain herself, but Yard refused to listen, continuing her tirade. Yen, on the verge of starting a new life, was trapped by the black-clad ghost and tormented. If Yen had any conscience, she would have helped Yard. The solution was simple. Yard needed to possess Yen's body to return to the living. Yen realized her hysteria had taken over, and in a panic, she bit her hand, hoping the pain would pull her out of the illusion. But under the combined influence of her hysteria and the black-clad ghost, the pain no longer had any effect. Blood poured from the walls like a torrential downpour, and in the blink of an eye, the floor beneath Yen became a sea of blood. In her hallucination, she was pushed into the sea of blood by Yard, but in reality, Yard was sitting on top of her, shoving her hand into her mouth. Yet in the mirror, there was no sign of Yard, only her own hand stuffing itself into her mouth, then pulling out a blood-soaked tooth. With that, the black-clad ghost finally had the necessary item to possess her body. Just as she was about to swallow the tooth, a sudden sound of a weapon cutting through the air startled her. She turned around in fright, even dropping the tooth onto the ground. But it wasn't Yak. Only the priest had arrived. It turned out that King Ghoul had given his invisibility bracelet to Yak. As long as he wore it, the ghost wouldn't be able to see him. Yak's sudden appearance almost overloaded the ghost's mind. The primitive forest was miles away from the hotel. How could an ordinary human make it back so quickly? Well, that's thanks to the priest's connections. Having been in the military, he had a few comrades who could fly planes, and it was one of those pilot friends who had flown Yak and the priest back. The black-clad ghost had never been on a plane, and she feared that Yak might eliminate her. Out of rage and fear, she exploded the hotel's glass walls, and in the chaos, she grabbed Yen. Yen was lifted by her neck, hanging outside the window. If the ghost loosened her grip, Yen would fall and be reduced to a pile of mush. If Yak wanted to save her, he would have to throw away the invisibility bracelet as the ghost instructed. The situation was dire, so Yak reluctantly followed the ghost's command. Without the bracelet, he revealed himself in front of the ghost, but the ghost still didn't spare Yen. She was thrown from the building. Fortunately, Yak reacted quickly and caught her, or it would have been a tragic loss of both life and money. Taking advantage of the chaos, the ghost found the invisibility bracelet. Just as she was about to destroy it, the priest unexpectedly shot at her. The black-clad ghost immediately began chanting an enchanting whisper, and the gun in the priest's hand slowly turned to aim at himself. Yak quickly pulled Yen up and grabbed the landlord's magic knife, rushing toward the ghost. But as he interrupted the ghost's spell, he exposed a gap in his defense and was seized by the ghost. Finally, the black-clad ghost kept talking smelly nonsense non-stop, but her joy was short-lived. She suddenly felt someone choking her, and before she knew it, her tongue was being yanked out of her mouth. The one pulling it out was none other than Yen, who had just escaped death. While the ghost was distracted, Yen had secretly put on the invisibility bracelet. As the ghost focused on Yak, she seized the opportunity to strike. Once the tongue had been pulled out far enough, Yak surged forward with a powerful strike, severing the tongue, and then delivered several more blows, forcing the ghost to retreat. He threw the magic knife to the priest, who pinned the ghost's juicy tongue to the ground, not allowing it to tongue massage anyone. In the blink of an eye, the tongue dissipated into smoke, but the black-clad ghost didn't die. Without the tongue, her strength was weakened, but Yak's enchanted bullets still couldn't kill her. That's when the invisibility bracelet came into play. The talisman on the bracelet was the ghost's true weakness. Yak took the talisman and, with a powerful punch, drove it into the ghost's forehead. Under the talisman's influence, the ghost was finally destroyed. Exhausted, Yak sank to his knees. Around him were his family, crying with relief, having survived the ordeal. Yen's fiancé and the priest were also exhausted but relieved. Not far off, Yard's soul had been freed from the ghost's control. She looked at her peaceful family and smiled before slowly disappearing before Yak's peeping eyes. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.